I had barely merged onto Highway 62 when Rosa called me, crying so hard I could barely make out the words. "Ma'am," she whispered. "Don't go home yet. Pull over and check the cameras." My hands tightened on the wheel. "Rosa, what happened? Please. Just look." There are moments your body understands danger before your mind catches up to it. Mine did right then. I took the next exit and pulled into an empty lot behind a shuttered feed store, the kind of place that only exists in towns built around a military base. My in-laws had been at Will Rogers Airport less than half an hour earlier, waving from beside their matching gray suitcases, supposedly headed to Denver before a 2-week ski trip. My mother-in-law, Patricia, had hugged me a beat longer than usual at the curb. "Take care of yourself, Elena," she'd said. At the time, I'd read it as warmth. I was 42, a major in the United States Army stationed at Fort Sill, and I had spent 19 years learning how to stay level when things went sideways: convoy delays, equipment shortfalls, young soldiers calling home to bad news from their families. Sitting in that gravel lot with my phone shaking slightly in my hand, I felt like every ounce of that training had temporarily evacuated my body. I opened the security app. Front porch camera, empty. Kitchen, nothing. Then I tapped the living room feed, and my husband, Mark, was standing beside our couch with his hands on another woman's hips, kissing her the unhurried way you kiss someone you've kissed 100 times before. She was wearing my navy cardigan, the one I kept on the hook by the back door because the house always ran cold in the mornings. An open bottle of the Cabernet my brigade commander had given us sat on the coffee table, half gone. I sat and watched for several long seconds before my thumb found the callback button. "Rosa," I said. "Where are you right now?" "In the laundry room. I came back for my blood pressure medication." I heard voices. "I thought it was you, home early." "Can they see me?" "No. Leave through the garage. Don't take anything but your purse." She hesitated. "Ma'am, I'm sorry. You have nothing to apologize for. My name is Major Elena Brooks, and before I explain the rest of it, I need you to understand something about the man I'd married." Mark ran a small financial advisory practice out of a strip mall in Lawton, the kind of business built almost entirely on trust and referrals from people who'd known his family for decades. We'd been married 16 years, since I was 26 and still a lieutenant, back when the idea of building a life around deployments and PCS moves felt like an adventure rather than a logistical puzzle. We'd met at a mutual friend's cookout the summer before I commissioned, and Mark had been the first civilian I'd dated who never once flinched at the idea of marrying someone whose career could uproot him every few years. I'd loved him for that, among other things, for a long time. We had a routine: Sunday church with his parents, dinner on the back porch when the weather allowed, the specific unremarkable rhythm of a marriage that had, as far as I believed, settled comfortably into itself. I'd never once questioned whether that rhythm was genuine on both sides. I understand now how much easier it is to build a convincing routine than it is to build an honest one, and how similar the two can look from the inside if you're not the one keeping the second set of books. I saved the video to my phone, then emailed a copy to myself. My training took over before my emotions could catch up with it. Preserve the evidence. Confirm the facts. Do not act until you understand the whole situation. I was reaching for the ignition when movement appeared again on the living room feed. A gray suitcase rolled into frame, the same suitcase I'd watched Walter load into their airport shuttle less than an hour earlier. Then Patricia stepped into my living room, laughing. For a second I told myself it had to be an old recording glitching, a delayed buffer, anything but what I was actually seeing. Then I noticed the timestamp in the corner. 11:52 a.m. live. I watched Patricia set the suitcase beside the couch as Walter came in behind her, and Mark wrapped an arm around his mother's shoulders like this was the most ordinary thing in the world. The woman he'd been kissing laughed and said something I couldn't quite hear. Patricia answered, clear enough for the microphone to catch it. Did she suspect anything at the curb? Mark shook his head. She never does. My stomach dropped, and not because of the affair anymore. Because all three of them were laughing together, comfortable, coordinated. This wasn't a secret Mark had been desperately hiding. His parents knew. They'd probably always known. I forced myself to keep watching instead of reacting, the same discipline I'd use assessing a chaotic scene before committing to a course of action. Patricia glanced toward the kitchen. Did Rosa leave? I think so, Mark said. She cleaned this morning. The woman with him frowned. You're sure she didn't see me? Mark waved a dismissive hand. She's 63. She barely notices anything. I almost laughed out loud in that empty parking lot. Rosa had probably noticed more about my marriage over the last several years than I had. I called her back immediately. She answered on the first ring, still whispering, still driving. I'm so sorry, Major Brooks. You don't owe me an apology. I should have told you sooner. Sooner than what? A pause. I've seen her before. That woman. I closed my eyes. How many times? I don't know exactly. Maybe 5. 6. The number landed harder than the kiss had. Not a single mistake. A routine. You never saw anything you could be sure of? No. Mr. Brooks always said she was a client. That sounded exactly like Mark, always a reasonable explanation ready before anyone thought to ask. But today, Rosa continued, your mother-in-law hugged her first. There wasn't any introduction. They already knew each other. That detail hurt more than the rest combined. Patricia hadn't stumbled onto the affair. She'd walked into my living room and greeted it like an old friend. I hung up and replayed the footage from the start, this time studying the room instead of the two people in it. 3 coffee cups on the counter. A bakery box from the donut shop on Cash Road, fresh, still open. Someone had planned that morning in detail. Then I checked the driveway camera. At 11:44 a.m., a black SUV had pulled in, no rideshare markings, no airport shuttle branding. Walter opened the trunk. Instead of luggage for a 2-week ski trip, there were exactly 2 small carry-on bags. The large gray suitcase, the one I'd watched loaded at curbside drop-off, had been completely empty. A prop. They had never intended to leave Oklahoma at all. My phone buzzed. A text from Mark, hope the drive back is smooth. Love you. I stared at it for a long moment before typing back, just left the base. See you tonight. 3 dots appeared. Sounds good. I watched, on the still open camera feed, Mark smile as he sent that message, then turn and kiss the woman again. A few minutes later, Patricia crossed the living room carrying a thick manila envelope, one word written across the front in black marker, attorney. I sat in my truck without turning the engine over for another 10 minutes, the July heat pressing through the windshield faster than the air conditioning could push it back. Around me, ordinary life kept moving, a farmer backing a trailer out of the feed store lot, a woman helping her toddler into a car seat. Mine had quietly come apart in the space of 20 minutes. I called my battalion XO first. Sir, this is Major Brooks. I've got a family emergency. I'll dial into this afternoon's briefing remotely if that works. You've never once asked for that kind of accommodation, Brooks. Take care of it. Thank you, sir. Then I called a divorce attorney another officer had once recommended after her own difficult separation, a woman named Diane Foster, whose office overlooked a small man-made lake on the edge of downtown Lawton. Her receptionist told me she was booked solid. I told her it was urgent. Within 30 seconds, she called back with an opening at 2 o'clock. Diane listened without interrupting while I played the footage on my phone. When Mark kissed the woman, she didn't react. When Patricia walked in with the suitcase, she folded her hands. When the manila envelope appeared, she leaned forward. Zoom in. Can you read that word? Attorney, I said. She nodded slowly. They're organized. You mean the affair? No, she said. I mean whatever they're planning underneath it. That sentence landed harder than I expected. She wasn't focused on the betrayal. She was focused on the preparation behind it. She handed me a legal pad. I want you thinking like an investigator for the next few weeks. Not like a wife. That one stung, but she was right. We built a rough timeline together. When had Mark started working unusual hours? When had our bank statements switched to paperless? When had Patricia suddenly volunteered to keep copies of our house documents in her fireproof safe in case of an electrical fire? At the time, every one of those things had sounded thoughtful. Laid out on a legal pad in a lawyer's office, they looked like scaffolding. That evening, after Mark had gone up to shower, humming to himself like a man with nothing on his mind, I logged into our joint investment account for the first time in months. Nearly $164,000 was gone, not withdrawn all at once, but moved in careful increments over roughly 7 months. 8,000 here. 12,000 there. Each transfer labeled with something bland: portfolio rebalance, asset reallocation. If I hadn't been looking specifically for trouble, I never would have noticed. I met Diane again 2 mornings later, and by early afternoon we'd pulled county property records showing 3 parcels tied to Mark's name: our home, a small rental property, and a lake house near Lake Murray I had never once heard mentioned in 16 years of marriage. Ownership had transferred to Patricia 6 weeks earlier for $1. You don't sell a lake house for $1, I said. No, Diane agreed. You hide one. I met Rosa for coffee that same week. She looked as exhausted as I felt. I've worked for your family for 8 years, she said quietly. I couldn't betray you. You've worked for me, Rosa. Not for them. Her eyes filled with tears, and for the first time in days, I felt something besides anger. Gratitude. Without her, I'd still be standing comfortably inside the version of my marriage Mark had spent years constructing for me. Diane called that Friday with an update. I believe Mark intends to file for divorce, she said. But he's not planning to serve you yet. He's waiting until after your training rotation to Fort Irwin next month. He'd been counting on distance to keep me too overwhelmed to fight back. For the next 2 weeks, I lived 2 lives at once, smiling over dinner, folding laundry beside a man I now understood I barely knew, while quietly building a paper trail with Diane during the day. It felt less like preparing for a divorce and more like assembling a jigsaw puzzle with no picture on the box to guide me. The real break came when Diane found a sworn statement Mark had filed months earlier while refinancing a business loan. Buried in it, my wife is frequently absent due to military obligations and has effectively abandoned the marital relationship. I'd deployed exactly once in 16 years, for 7 months. I hadn't abandoned anything. He'd simply written a version of our marriage that made his choices look inevitable instead of deliberate. Diane's investigation eventually connected the missing investment funds directly to the lake house, over $110,000 in renovations, invoiced before ownership quietly transferred to his mother's name. I'd unknowingly financed a house I no longer legally had any claim to. The next thread came from a woman named Vanessa Cole, 35, a pharmaceutical rep out of Oklahoma City. When I finally called her, expecting to be hung up on, she answered instead with one tired sentence: I've been wondering when you'd find me. We met in Diane's office so neither of us would feel ambushed. Vanessa sat across from me and said, simply, I'm sorry. I didn't know he was still your husband. He told me the divorce was already finalized last winter. She pulled printed emails from her bag, one after another. He'd told her I refused to sign paperwork. That I'd moved on to base permanently. That we hadn't shared a bedroom in over 3 years. Each lie felt smaller than the last, not because they didn't matter, but because there were so many of them. Mark had clearly lost track of which version belonged to which woman. I asked him once why he still wore his wedding ring, Vanessa said. He told me it would create problems with clients. I laughed, the first real laugh I'd had in weeks. That sounds exactly like something he'd say. The tension in the room eased, just slightly. Diane asked careful questions: how long, whether Vanessa had met his parents. She had. Several times. They'd invited her to a family dinner I'd spent that same week working a flooding response 200 miles away, believing his parents had simply kept the holiday small that year. Would you testify, if it comes to that? Diane asked. Vanessa was quiet for a long moment. Yes, she finally said. Because last week I found out he proposed to someone else. Diane and I both looked up. I guess neither of us was the only one, Vanessa said, with a bitter little laugh. Mark's deposition took place in a plain downtown conference room, fluorescent lights humming overhead, a court reporter's fingers already resting on her machine. He walked in wearing his good sport coat, smiling like we were meeting for lunch. You look good, he said. I've been sleeping better, I told him, and watched that catch him off guard for exactly 1 second before his smile came back. His attorney opened with routine questions: marriage, income, property. Mark answered smoothly, clearly rehearsed, the same easy confidence he'd used to explain away every strange transfer and every paperless billing switch over the past year. I'd spent 16 years believing that confidence meant honesty. Sitting across from him that morning, I finally understood it had only ever meant practice. Then Diane stood. Mr. Brooks, when did your relationship with Vanessa Cole begin? I don't know anyone by that name. Diane slid a photograph across the table: Mark and Vanessa walking hand in hand through a farmer's market, time-stamped 10 months earlier. A business acquaintance, Mark said. Diane added another photo. Dinner at a steakhouse. A weekend at Lake Murray. Mark kissing Vanessa outside a hotel. His attorney rubbed his forehead. I may have socialized with her, Mark allowed. While telling her your divorce had already been finalized? I never said that. Diane pressed a button on a small recorder. Vanessa's voice filled the room. Mark told me the divorce was finished before Christmas. Then Mark's own voice, unmistakable, I know. I just haven't taken the ring off yet. The room went completely silent. His attorney closed his legal pad slowly. The questions kept coming: the cabin transfer for $1, the renovation invoices, each answered with I don't recall, until Diane asked one final question. How many romantic relationships were you involved in during the past year? Mark sighed. That's not relevant. It is today. He glanced toward his attorney, toward the door, and finally said, 1. At that exact moment, the door opened and Vanessa walked in, having waited outside the entire time. Mark's face went completely white. Which one of us were you actually planning to marry? She asked, steady, no theatrics in her voice at all. You told me Elena was gone. She looked at me. I'm sorry. Then back to Mark. And last week I found out you proposed to someone in Dallas. His attorney's pen slipped out of his hand. Mark opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The hearing took place on a Wednesday morning at the Comanche County Courthouse. I woke before dawn the way I always did on duty days, sat for a few minutes on the edge of the bed listening to the quiet house, and understood this was probably the last morning Mark and I would ever spend under the same roof, not because I wanted him to stay, but because I'd never once imagined 16 years of marriage would end inside a courtroom instead of somewhere quieter. I wore my dress uniform, every ribbon and crease exactly where it belonged, not to impress anyone, but because that uniform represented something Mark had spent months quietly trying to dismantle: my own credibility. Judge Marilyn Voss listened to testimony from Rosa, who described the day plainly, without exaggeration. I've cleaned that house every week for 8 years. I know the difference between a greeting and a kiss. A few people in the gallery smiled. Vanessa testified next, admitting her own mistakes without excusing them. Then Diane introduced the footage: the kiss, Patricia's arrival, the envelope, Walter carrying boxes from the garage over several weekends, all synced against bank records showing the same timeline. Mark took the stand. His attorney tried to salvage what was left. Were these financial decisions made in good faith? Yes. Diane's cross-examination lasted less than 10 minutes and left almost nothing standing. Judge Voss recessed for lunch and returned at 1:30 with her ruling. She found overwhelming evidence that Mark had intentionally concealed marital assets and transferred jointly owned property in anticipation of divorce. The lake house transfer for $1 was declared a fraudulent conveyance, reverting immediately to the marital estate. Mark was ordered to reimburse the missing investment funds in full, including every dollar spent renovating a house that was never legally his mother's to keep. I was awarded the home in Lawton. He kept his practice, but only after a substantial equalization payment and covering the bulk of legal costs due to his conduct during discovery. Marriage sometimes fails, Judge Voss said, looking directly at Mark before she closed the folder. Dishonesty is what turned this into something far more serious. Outside the courthouse, Walter lingered while Patricia hurried after Mark without a backward glance. "I owe you an apology," Walter said quietly. "I should have stopped this. It became my business," he added, "the day I stayed quiet. I told him I hoped he'd find peace." He nodded once and walked away, and I understood that some apologies simply arrive too late to fix what they're apologizing for. I paid off Rosa's mortgage the following month. She'd spent 8 years taking care of my home, and when my world came apart, she chose honesty over comfort. No court order could repay that properly, but it felt like a start. It's been 8 months now. I still serve at Fort Sill, recently stepped into a role with a little more responsibility and a small office overlooking the motor pool. Mornings still start the same way: coffee before sunrise, physical training, paperwork that somehow multiplies overnight. After everything, that kind of ordinary honesty felt like a gift I hadn't fully appreciated before. The Army never once cared about the state of my marriage. It simply expected me to show up and do the job, and I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I still could. Rosa still works for me, though at this point we both just call her family. She brings tamales every Christmas Eve, and I still pretend to argue about letting her, and she still ignores me entirely. Some traditions are worth keeping exactly as they are. The day her mortgage paperwork came through marked paid in full, she cried before she'd even finished reading it. "You spent 8 years taking care of my home," I told her. "I only did what anyone should do," she said. "No," I told her. "You did what a lot of people are too afraid to do. You told me the truth." I stopped tracking what happened to Mark. Not out of forgiveness, exactly, more because I simply didn't need to know anymore. I heard, through people who still talk, that his practice lost several longtime clients once the divorce became public record, that the lake house eventually sold to someone else entirely, that he'd moved into a small apartment outside town. Whether he found any real happiness after all of it, I honestly don't know, and for the first time in a long while, that not knowing didn't feel like loss. It felt like freedom. I started volunteering once a month with a support group for military spouses navigating divorce. I don't stand up front pretending to have all the answers. I just tell my own story, plainly, the way Rosa first told hers to me over a shaking phone call from a laundry room. One woman stayed behind after a meeting recently and asked how I'd stopped wanting revenge. "I didn't," I told her. "I just realized revenge was never actually what I wanted." "What did you want?" "The truth," I said. Once it finally had room to speak for itself, I didn't need to carry the anger around anymore. I don't know if she fully believed me that day. I think, eventually, she will. Some of the hardest phone calls of your life turn out, much later, to be the ones that quietly set you free.